So welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this session on behavioural insights for animal husbandry. I did have a pause for laughter now. I'm glad you did. Don't worry, I'm joking. Of course, this session is a practitioner session entitled How Well Do We Really Know Ourselves and Others and Each Other? So I'm delighted to be joined by two wonderful and, dare I say, provocative thinkers. So we have Professor Nick Chater and Dr. Seth Stephens-Davidowitz, who said I wasn't going to be able to say his name, and I've just nailed it. So we'll start with Seth. He'll start the podium first. So Seth did his doctorate in economics at Harvard. He's worked with Google as a data scientist. He writes for, in Donald Trump's words, the failing New York Times. And he'll talk first to us on the thesis of his book, Everybody Lies, which explores how our grubby digital fingerprints can tell us more about ourselves than, frankly, any of us might have ever wanted to know. Nick will then take the podium. So Nick is the founder of the Warwick Business School Behavioural Science Group and the co-founder of the research consultancy Decision Technology. Drawing on new research in neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and perception, Nick is going to try and persuade all of you curious, wonderful minds in here that mental depth is, in fact, an illusion. In the words of the title of his book, The Mind is Flat and There Is No Inner World. We will then do a question and answer session once our two wonderful speakers have rejoined me in the chairs. Questions will be taken over Slido. I'm sure most of you are now absolutely adept at using Slido. If you're not, you can access it in the app. You can also go on the Slido website. You just type in sli.do. Our event is #D265. And crucially, you are in the Fleming room. You need to ask questions in the right room, or some poor speaker in another room is going to be getting something that they don't know. They don't know what's going on. Although if you've got any particularly difficult ones, chuck them over into somewhere else. So without further ado, I'm delighted to pass the floor to Seth.
Good afternoon. I don't have any slides, so that screen's not going to change. For the past 80 years, if you want to understand what people are thinking, what they're going to do, why they do the things they do, you have one approach. You ask them. So Gallup or Pew or some other organization will conduct a survey. And there's kind of a secret problem with surveys, which is that people lie to surveys a lot. So sometimes they tell you not what they're really thinking or not really going to do, but what they think will make them sound good. It's called social desirability bias. And the level of deception can be rather staggering. So for example, immediately after an election in the United States, they've done studies where they found that more than half of people who said they were going to vote when you asked them actually didn't vote at all. Because everybody wants to say, I'm going to exercise my civic duty, of course I'm going to go out and vote. So this is problematic, and we now have really a new, I think, revolutionary way to understand the human psyche, so we don't have to rely just on surveys. And that is people's Google searches. So for the past 8 years or so, I've been analyzing this data. I call Google digital truth serum, because people are really honest on Google. They tell Google things that they might not tell anybody else, that they might not tell their friends, their partners, surveys, their neighbors. They really kind of pour out their hearts to Google, and you get kind of an unprecedented window into the human psyche. So for example, worldwide, historically, there have been more searches on Google for porn than for weather. Even though if you ask people, fewer than 20% of people admit that they watch porn, presumably everybody admits that they check the weather, right? But it's hard to reconcile that with porn being searched more than weather. Actually, now that I'm a Google search expert, before I visit a country, I tend to analyze the Google search data on that country to kind of understand the people better. And so before I came to Britain, I looked at the data, and I found out that you guys, the British, you're one of the only ones who search weather more than porn. So I don't know if that's something to be proud of or something to be ashamed of. but it definitely is something. And when you analyze this data, you get a totally, I think, really new insights on many, many topics. So one of the first topics I studied was racism. If you ask people in a survey, are you racist? What do you think they say? No, of course not. Not in a million years. You got the wrong person. It's considered socially unacceptable to have racist attitudes. And I was shocked. I started doing this research in 2012, shortly after Obama had been elected the first time. And there was this idea in the United States that we lived in a post-racial society, that racism was a thing of the past. If you ask people, are you racist? Do you care about the president's skin color? All those questions, everybody would say, no, 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 of course not. And I was shocked by how frequently people made racist searches, really explicit racist searches on Google. So searches for things like N-word jokes. And you can imagine what's the mindset of someone making that search, looking for entertainment, basically mocking African Americans. And millions of Americans are making this search every year. It was searched as frequently as terms like Lakers and migraine and economist. So it wasn't a fringe search by any stretch of the imagination. It was really a common search. And it really flared up a lot during Obama's presidency. So the week Obama was first elected had the highest search volume for the N-word of any time in its history. And on the night Obama was first elected, 1 in 100 searches that included the word Obama also included the N-word or KKK, which is a pretty enormous number when you think of all the reasons to Google Obama on that night. And again, none of this would have been picked up by the traditional sources by asking people. Everybody, if you asked them, said whatever they felt about a Democrat winning, that they were happy, that it was a good thing that we had an African-American president. But you really had a totally different view on Google. And you can also use analyzing Google data. And since this is a session for practitioners, anybody can go and look at Google Trends and analyze this data. So you can put in search terms and see where people are making searches, when people are making searches. I think it's a really, really powerful tool to understand people. And this data, I had written some papers and said that there's a lot of racism in the United States that just isn't being picked up by traditional sources. And it was a little bit ignored for a while until the recent Republican presidential primary, where a certain candidate, Donald Trump, was saying some very racially charged things. So he started his political career questioning whether the first black president, Barack Obama, was born in the United States, and he retweeted false statistics about how frequently African Americans commit crime, and he failed to repudiate support from David Duke, the leader of the KKK. And every time he did this, everyone said, he's done. You can't do these things in the United States of America and stay a serious candidate for the presidency. And yet, he did better and better each time. And I had a map of the racist searches on Google, and someone asked me, is Nate Cohn, a data journalist at the New York Times, he said, could I see that map? I have data on support for Donald Trump in the primary. And he found that racist searches on Google was the single highest predictor of anything for support for Donald Trump, higher than any exposure to trade or economic positions or conservative attitudes. So I think there was clearly a secret racism in the United States that was very strong during Obama's presidency that wasn't being picked up by traditional sources, but was apparent if you analyze the search data that really helped drive Trump to victory. And it really is amazing. I didn't know what Professor Sunstein was going to talk about, but this really matches exactly what he was talking about, where you might not have been able to predict the exact moment that racism would reach a tipping point to bring us a Donald Trump-like figure, but I think you could clearly have seen in the search data that there was a lot of explicit racism towards African Americans that was kind of waiting for a candidate to latch onto. And really, you can use this data all kinds of different ways to measure many, many, many things that otherwise would be difficult to measure. I've done research on child abuse as well. So that's one where governments collect data. But the problem with this data, with the official reported data, is that we suspect that more than half of child abuse cases are never actually reported to the government. They're kind of missing. And this is sad, but a decent number of older children make searches on Google, making it very clear that they've just experienced a child abuse incident. They search things like, my dad hit me, or my mom beat me. It's really, really sad and hard to even look at. But you can use this data to kind of get a different proxy of how much child abuse is happening. And we suspect that many of these cases probably are never going to be reported to authorities. Almost no cases, very, very few cases are actually reported from children themselves. Children frequently do not feel comfortable reporting child abuse to authorities. So, and I actually have used this data to see that sometimes there's a difference between what you see on Google and what you see from the official data. So for example, during recessions, frequently there's a drop in reported cases of child abuse, which seems kind of surprising because you'd think with many people unemployed and stressed and angry and drinking more, unfortunately a fraction of them would take it out on children. But actually official cases tend to go down. But on Google, you see more searches from kids suggesting their parents just hit them. And I think what happens is the resources are so depleted by organizations during a recession that these cases don't get reported. So these hidden cases are kind of showing up on Google, and we wouldn't know about otherwise. So all my topics, by the way, are really, really depressing and dark. I should have warned you maybe beforehand, but we covered racism, we covered child abuse. Now I'm going to talk about suicide, another cheery topic. And I've been doing research recently where you can actually analyze. It's not surprising, but a large number of people turn to Google when they're having mental health troubles, including thoughts of suicide. And other scholars have found that these searches, people making searches like how to commit suicide or suicidal or suicide help or suicide hotline, when these searches are high, there tend to be more suicides as well. And the Google searches, the scholars found, actually correlated much higher with actual suicides than surveys asking people about suicidal ideation. But recently I've become interested in whether you can use this data to understand why people have thoughts of suicide. So what do they search kind of before they search for thinking of suicide? And this data is all anonymous and aggregate. But one of the things I found, which maybe isn't so surprising, is that the big reason people search for, the big kind of complaint before a suicide search, the most common complaint is a health complaint. And again, maybe not so surprising, and you might even be able to guess what the number one health complaint that's followed by a suicide search is. Does anybody have a guess? Yeah, I think someone mentioned it. Depression. It's not surprising at all. Like, we know that mental depression and mental illness are major risk factors for suicide. And so I don't think we need Google searches even to tell us that. It's pretty much well known in the mental health community. But then I found out that right near the top for conditions that are health conditions that are followed by suicide searches is herpes and other STDs, which shocked me. I would have never guessed that, not in a million years. It's not usually thought of as a disease that's greeted by suicidal ideation. And I think we wouldn't know that otherwise because people don't feel comfortable sharing that they have a herpes diagnosis or that they're thinking of suicide or that herpes is causing them to think of suicide. So it's something that I think would be really otherwise difficult to see except for this really unprecedented window into people's minds from Google searches. And it's also pretty disturbing because unlike many illnesses, there aren't that many severe physical impacts from herpes. The major reason that I think many people, particularly young people, greet a diagnosis of herpes with thoughts of suicide is the stigma that they think they kind of have a scarlet letter now that they have gotten this diagnosis. And I actually looked deeper into the data, and I looked for what searches people make in a session where they also search for herpes and suicide. And I found out the number one other search was celebrities with herpes. And you could imagine someone doing that. Actually, it's a very common search for many illnesses. Anytime people have an illness, I think there is an instinct for a lot of people to kind of search for role models who also share the illness to maybe feel better about it. So I kind of looked around what comes up when you make such a search, celebrities with herpes. What happens to these young people who just got diagnosed with herpes, are thinking of suicide, and now search celebrities with herpes? And I found that it's very different from almost every other illness. So most illnesses, whether it's depression or back pain or just about anything you could think of, if you search celebrities with that, you'll have pages and pages of celebrities and your heroes who say they have that problem and want to lower the stigma of that illness. But when someone searches herpes with celebrities, you basically just get accused celebrities denying they ever have this illness, which is actually, I think, problematic. There are a couple low-level celebrities who have said they had it to fight the stigma, but I think that's actually problematic when you think that now we know, thanks to search data, that a certain fraction of people, particularly young people, greet this illness with thoughts of suicide, and some of them might actually even go through and end their lives for this reason that I think everybody would agree is not a reason to commit suicide or think of suicide. And when they turn looking for heroes, for role models who make them feel better, I think instead of getting kind of their heroes, some of their heroes saying that it's nothing to be ashamed of, I have this as well, they have a few of their heroes denying they'd ever have such a horrible illness. So basically now my whole goal in life is just to convince celebrities to say they have herpes, which it makes people giggle, but I think it actually, when you put the data together, it literally would save lives. And that's kind of the type of thing you'd only get from Google search data. And I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to end on that note and take questions afterwards, but now I'll leave it to Nick. Thanks.
So Seth was telling us how people hide their true selves, how they often reveal when they're Googling things that they wouldn't actually say out loud. And I think there's another reason, I want to tell you a bit about this reason now, why people's self-presentation is rather misleading about what we're really like. And that's because we simply don't know. So to a large degree, I think we have the same strategy when we're trying to understand ourselves that we have when we're looking at other people. And so when I see other people going about their daily lives, they say things, they do things, I think, oh, well, you must believe this, you must think that, you seem to be a cheerful sort of person. I'm doing that very same inferential work when I'm looking at my own life. Now that seems weird, because at least you might think, well, surely I have a special route into my own life. I just have to sort of turn the lens of perception inwards. I just need to introspect, look inside myself, and there will be my feelings, my attitudes, my latent racism. It's all going to be there, visible to me. But that's not right. I want to suggest to you that the sense that we can turn the lens onto ourselves is actually a complete illusion. And the way we actually figure out what we're like and what we believe and what our attitudes are is by inferring from the things we do and say. I want to start, though, with the thesis that the mind is flat from a perceptual point of view. I want to start by saying, well, let's consider perception, which is one of the things in psychology we understand fairly well. Not tremendously well, but better than other bits of psychology. So we'll start where the ground is solid, and I'll tell you about a remarkable illusion. Some of you will know this very well. A remarkable illusion about the way we perceive the world and the way we think we perceive the world. And that illusion will turn out to be very relevant. Indeed, I think the same illusion that we have when we try to understand ourselves. We have this sense that there's an inner well of knowledge and experience flowing up from within, telling me what I'm like. So let me start with an example. Now, I don't know, it always depends on the screen whether this example works. Can you see a grid with 4x3 grid with 12 black dots, and they're stable? Or are they unstable? I'm hoping they're unstable. Are they moving around? Some are going, some are coming. Yeah, God, that's great. Doesn't always work depending on the projector. So this is a wonderful illusion created by Jacques Nignot, French vision scientist. And there is nothing tricky going on here. This is a completely static image. And you'll find that if you look closely at a particular dot, there it is. If you look at a pair, you might see a pair. You might see a horizontal line. You might see a diagonal. You might see a square. You will never see all 12. That's very, very weird. Now, in fact, these dots are specially created to be rather hard to spot. A blurry dot with its black and its little whites around blurs into a grey, which is just the same as the grey struts around it. So if you're not looking directly at one of these dots, they're kind of hard to see. And in fact, you need top-down pattern completion machinery to help you see them. So you know what a square is, you know what a line is, and because you have those higher level concepts, you can impose enough structure onto the image to say, I've got 4, look, it's square, or, oh, a diagonal line. Here's something interesting, though. You never see 2 patterns at once. You can see a line, horizontal line, you can see a square, you can see a diagonal. You will never see 2 patterns. And that's because, I claim, of the fundamentally serial nature of perception. All you can do is see or generate or create 1 pattern at a time. And if you're seeing 1 pattern, you're not seeing any other patterns. That's very weird. Doesn't feel like that, but that's what I want to persuade you of as step 1. Here's a lovely example along the same lines. This is Huang and Paschler, very, very well-known psychologists of attention. So the experiment here is to take grids of, colored grids of square grids, and to ask people things like, are these the same? So let's just look at the top row there. Are they the same? Well, actually, it's kind of a hard question, isn't it? It's weird, really. You'd think if you saw 2 faces, you'd think, oh, yeah, they're the same face. No, they're different faces. Whereas something as simple as a colored grid, it's a slow process. There's a way of doing it, though, which is a bit quicker. And I suspect if you've been looking and paying attention for a few seconds, you'll have found it. The way to do it is to think color by color. So if you look at the top one, say, and think, well, what about the reds? You can suddenly see that red pattern on the top of the right-hand side. You can see the reds in one square. You can see the reds in the other square. They are the same. Reds are sorted. Now the greens, now the yellows, now the blues. So you can grasp a single color and the pattern created by a single color, but you can only grasp 1 pattern at a time. So it would be great if you could grasp all 4 patterns for all the 4 different colors and compare them, but you can't. You have to think red, then green, then yellow, then blue. 1 at a time. Let me give you another example, which is an amazing example going back to the early 70s. This is work done in Keith Rayner's lab, then at MIT, then later at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So this is an experiment where you give people a text to read on a computer screen, and using the magic of what's called gaze contingent eye tracking, which is the simple technology, conceptually, but difficult to actually implement, that you, as people's eyes move around, you create the image specific to where they're looking. So as I hop across the sentence here being, I can't read it with my glasses, but it's something like, it's surprising how little one sees when one reads a sentence or something of that kind. As I read the sentence, then wherever I'm looking, letters appear. But everywhere else, it's X's. So if you were looking over my shoulder, you'd see a little block of sensible text against a background of X's, and that block of sensible text would go hop, 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 hop across the screen. So that's what you'd see looking over my shoulder. What do I see? If you ask me, well, how does it feel? Can you read okay? I'd say, well, yeah, because what's happening? I mean, I'm just reading normally. What's different to normal? Now, if you said, yeah, what about those X's? I'd say, I can't see the X's. And as soon as I looked for some X's, of course, they wouldn't be there. Suddenly letters would appear. So I look from one word to the next word to the next word, and I'll find that wherever I look, they're letters. Where have those X's gone? Well, you can't see the X's because you can only, in fact, process roughly, this is a bit too strong, but roughly 1 word at a time. Small words you can process by hopping over them. But roughly speaking, 1 word is all you can do. So if you're processing 1 word, apart from a little bit of stuff in the periphery, you're basically oblivious to everything else. That's too strong, but not that much. And this is true quite generally. So if we had the same trick with this audience, I look out and I think, faces everywhere, people with outfits and glasses and all kinds of complexity. But actually, I can only see 1 of you at a time. So if I'm looking at 1 of you, all the others could be blurred out, and I wouldn't know the difference. Let me just give you quickly a quick summary thought before we talk about how that applies to high-level things like understanding myself. What's going on here is there's a profound illusion. The illusion is the world seems to me very, very rich. I think there's incredible detail. I think there's color everywhere. I think I'm recognizing lots of faces all at once. I'm reading whole pages of words all at once. And that's an illusion. But the illusion's sustained because wherever I look, detail appears, color appears, words appear. So if I think, oh, what about over there? Ping, there's an answer. There's that, it's that word. What's over there? Oh, that word. What's that color? And my eye flicks into action and tells me the color. So I have the sense that it's all at my fingertips. In fact, it is all at my, as it were, mental fingertips. All the information is ready when I need it. But it isn't actually loaded into my brain, and we know it isn't, because if it was, you'd spot the X's. And you'd realize that most of what you were seeing was in fact junk. But think about now the question of understanding yourself. If I ask myself, do I have latent racist attitudes, or why did I choose the train to come today, or any question at all, out pops an answer. Quiz that question, out pops another answer. I'm a great fluid speaker about myself. So ask me anything and I'll give you an answer. And of course it's very easy to think, it's right there. The answer's just there, I'm just picking them out from inside. Must have this vast repository of knowledge about myself, which I'm referring to. But remember, that's the exact illusion we just encountered in perception. I think all the detail of the visual environment is there for me, but it isn't. I find it when I need it. And the same is true when you're thinking about who you are, why you chose a particular trade, what your attitudes are. You're creating them when you need them, and not a moment before. Let me give you a few very quick examples, and we'll draw some more positive conclusions about the unity of human beings and wrap up. But this should be a little bit unsettling. So suppose, for example, I'm trying to look at trying to interpret another person. So here is Ivan Mozukhin, who's a Russian actor in the early days of cinema, I think in the silent era, and Kuleshov, his director, noticed the following thing, that Mozukhin in these images here seems to be engaging in a remarkable level of understated acting. I mean, here on the top level, top row, he's looking pained and upset in a distressing situation, hungry, strangely enough, in the middle row, and there's definitely a sign of lust creeping in on the bottom row. And yet, of course, this is the very same picture. This is something that Alfred Hitchcock was very, very keen on, I think, used. So the very same image is interpreted in a different way, depending on what it's paired with. But now you should think, but then if I were interpreting my own facial expression, then I should have the same thing. If I catch myself in the mirror and think, how am I feeling? I'm in the same position as we are with this character. I'm not just looking, the face itself is highly, highly ambiguous. So I can catch myself in the mirror, as it were, looking exactly the same, but in a situation where something bad's happened, I think, I'm looking gloomy and distressed. In a situation where some food is present, I can think, I'm looking hungry. Here's another example of the same thing, taken from Trends in Cognitive Science. Is a lovely example. Here is a Senator Jim Webb. He's out campaigning. You can see on the right-hand side, he's looking delighted and excited and ecstatic. Everything's going well. Everyone's behind him. But of course, on the left-hand side, a blow-up of the very same picture shows him looking unbelievably angry. Again, the ambiguity is the thing here. The stimulus itself is massively ambiguous. And I want you to realize that that's going to be true of your own perceptual experience, of your own body. If you caught yourself in the mirror, or more importantly, if you're interpreting your own physiological signals, for example, adrenaline, you have to do the same trick of thinking, what do these mean? What am I feeling now? You don't have a route into your psyche. You have to figure out, am I angry? Am I sad? What am I feeling? Let me give you an illustration of that. Let me jump to time is short. Let me give you an illustration from a lovely old study by Dutton and Aaron, conducted on the University of British Columbia campus in the early 70s. This gives you a sense of your interpretive processes you use to understand yourself, rather than somehow having a direct line into your own subconscious. So here, people are walking across a high, scary bridge. I think this is the actual bridge, but I'm not completely sure, in the UBC campus. And lower down the creek, there's a low bridge, which isn't scary at all. And they station attractive female experimenters who catch male bridge crossers, mostly students, and give them a short questionnaire. And as part of that, they say, for ethical reasons, if you ever have it, I can give you my phone number if you are interested in following up with any of the issues raised by this questionnaire. And so they measure two things, one of which is, do people ask for the phone number? And the other is, do they ring it? And the wonderful thing is that people will both ask for and ring the phone number substantially more, about 60% more, if they've just walked across the high bridge. Now, that's very weird. Why would they do that? And the ringing, of course, is occurring much in the future, maybe hours, days later. What's lovely about this experiment is it came out of a prediction. It's a very strange prediction, but the prediction is this. If you don't have a direct line into your psyche, you don't actually even know who you're attracted to. Even something as basic as that. So how do you figure it out? Well, one reason is you can figure it out, one clue, is adrenaline. So you meet a new person, you get a surge of adrenaline, you might think, oh, right, this person's scary, no, that might not be it. This person is tremendously amusing, that might be it. Or it might be, oh, maybe I'm finding them very attractive. If you've just walked across a high bridge, you're full of adrenaline. You then meet someone, you do a questionnaire, and you're thinking, crumbs, I don't normally have this where people ask me questionnaires, but I've just got this crazy amount of adrenaline. There must be something going on here. I'll give her a ring. So that's telling you that even something as elemental, you'd think, as figuring out who you're attracted to, is something you have to figure out. It's not given to you. It doesn't well up from within. You have to use the clues that are given to you. And that's just the same, almost anyway, as the clues that you'd use if it was someone else. So if you looked at someone else and they were sort of sweating and looking kind of a bit overwrought, you might well think, you obviously like that person. But of course you're having to get that signal from yourself, from your own body. Now, I've tried to give you a sense that we are, when we're looking at the perceptual world, we think we have this enormous richness, but actually we're making it up piece by piece, fragment by fragment. But we can do it so fluently, it feels like the whole is always present. And I want to remind you that's what's going on in your own, when you're thinking about your own self too. So you're an incredible, fluent, super clever improviser. And ask you a question, you give me an answer. If I ask another question, you'll give me another answer. And that will appear to be generated from some gigantic memory bank of answers about all the things that I am, all the attitudes I have. But if you go down this improvisational track, you might think, well, this is all very well, and you should paint us in some ways in a very good light, because it means we're fantastically creative beings. I think we absolutely are. But on the other hand, you might think, yes, but why are we stable at all? Why are we not just gibbering jellies? When we know, if we study behavioral science, that people can be pushed around by context, pushed around by the social situation. That's true, but we're not completely unstable. We do learn, we do have fairly stable personalities over time. So we're not completely uncontrolled. So I want to give you, in the final minute or two, the counterweight to this, which is why are we stable? And I think the way you should think about the stability of our individual minds is not as coming from within, but as coming from the past. So the brain works by creating the solution to the moment's problems by referring back to problems of a similar sort that you've solved before. So every time you engage in a new challenge, you evaluate a new person, you solve a new crossword puzzle, you learn something new, that information is there to be reused and reused again in future thinking. It's not lurking in some completely different form, in some subconscious. It was always conscious. It's now there to be taken, varied, mutated for future use. And I want to suggest that people are really, really flexible at doing this. We're amazingly flexible, creative beings when it comes to using the past experiences to shape the future. But it's the past experiences that make humans integral beings. We should think of ourselves as traditions. A couple of quick examples. Here's this lovely spiky sphere from the Japanese physicist and vision scientist Itasawa. Your brain has taken those pieces on the right, which happen to be rearranged on the left, to suddenly create a lovely white sphere, which looks a little brighter than the background. And you've never seen something like that before, most likely, but your brain's immediately able to do it. That's phenomenal. But you have experience of spikes, of spheres, of many other geometrical objects. You're able to use that experience in an incredibly creative way. So don't underestimate your remarkable creative powers. Here's a slightly sillier example, but I think actually quite a telling one. Here are some faces. These are nothing like human faces. So most computer recognition algorithms are not going to classify these as faces at all, because they are not faces. On the other hand, we have lovely, rich stories to tell about them. Let me just say about the left-hand face, for example. This is a face that wants to be angry and scare you. But it just can't pull it off, and it sort of knows it. You can just see its sort of sense of, I'm snarling, I'm trying to be beastly and mean, I just can't quite pull it off. And the sort of plaintiveness of that poor cheese grater, it's trying to be loved, but it's just not working. So I mean, the terror for the poor old sink there, I mean, it's just something awful is about to happen. You just think, just let it happen, be done with it. And the fact that we can project so richly is telling us that our ability to make mappings between human faces and very, very far away things from human faces is fantastically good, but it's indicative of our general fantastic metaphorical abilities. I want to finish with one final thought. When you look at many visual stimuli, particularly the ones psychologists like, here are some created by a graphic designer, Oscar Reutervard, in Sweden, and now celebrated in Swedish stamps, you see patterns like this, which look like perfectly coherent objects. But when you look at them closely, you realize they don't really make sense. These aren't really objects that could live in 3D. As you study them closely, you realize that the same thing should be both in front of and behind some other thing. That's all very odd. Now, what's going on there? I think what's going on is that in an image like this, and you'll see many others by Maurice Escher, very likely, every piece of the puzzle looks coherent. But if you try and put the puzzle together, it doesn't make sense, and that's the clue. That's the clue that these are not real 3D objects. Your mind is exactly in this category. Every time I ask you a question, you'll give me an answer. I ask you another question, you'll give me another answer. If I try and piece the answers together, they won't fit. And that's because you've been making them up all along. Right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both of you. So I'm going to give you a bit of a break, Nick, and start on Seth immediately. A lot of the questions, Seth, have been about the kind of practical, how do I do this side of things. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, and also how policymakers might use this as a sort of tool of what they do?
Yeah, so the tool I suggest is Google Trends, which you can just Google, actually. And I have on my website, SethSD.com, a co-written paper with Hal Varian, who's the chief economist at Google, that you can just download that kind of gives you some insights into how to make sense of Google Trends data. Everyone who goes to Google Trends initially is just totally confused and lost. It has kind of weird ways of presenting data. It says something's 100 means something different than you think 100 means, so it takes a little while to understand it, but maybe hopefully that paper can help with that. And as far as how policymakers can use it, I would say your ideas are probably better than my ideas. I think we don't really know because it's early in the tool's history. The tool hasn't existed that long, and I think what happens is sometimes you might have an idea and say, oh, maybe it would be useful to look at Google Trends. This may help with the example. I think one thing I caution people, though, so I wrote a book on this whole topic, Everybody Lies, and that was kind of my highlights of analyzing Google data every day of my life from the moment I woke up till I went to sleep for like 5 years. So I kind of left the things that worked, and then everyone just assumes, oh wow, this is like a miracle cure. Any question I have, I'll just go to Google Trends, and it's not that simple. So many questions. It's not like just you can answer any question with Google search data. All the time I get people ask me, can you measure something with Google Trends? Oh, can you measure how many people really support gun control using Google search data? And I'm kind of like, I don't think so. I don't know. I don't know how, as advantageous as Google Trends may be for getting people to admit things that they wouldn't otherwise, people don't just say on Google, I support gun control or I don't support gun control. So it's really hard to know exactly how to interpret the data. It works for some questions, better for some questions than for other questions. Don't assume that you're going to get a perfect answer for any question you have, but keep the tool in the back of your mind for kind of any question that comes up. That was being very negative about Google search data. I think one positive thing I'd say is for just about any question, there's probably something interesting in that data that you might not have otherwise known that definitely will let you understand the issue better. So it's always something to kind of turn. It's a great tool to turn to for just about any topic.
Great. Another question I think somewhat relates that people had was, what about stuff that people just Google for curiosity, or they're a writer writing a book? Like I said to you before, the time I Googled, does my cat love me? It was definitely for research purposes. Like, how would you kind of treat that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely writers do make Google searches for research purposes. People are always like, would you be embarrassed? Again, all the data I do is anonymous and aggregate. I don't know what anybody searches, but everyone's like, would you be embarrassed if your search data was revealed? And I'm like, no, because I could credibly say every single search was for my book. Research for my book, right? But I think definitely a lot of people make searches for curiosity. I think it's a smaller number than you might think, and it's kind of usually washed in the data by other reasons to make searches. So I searched the N-word many, many times when I was writing my paper on how this is a measure for racism, just to see what came up, just all kinds of reasons to make that search for me. And it wasn't like Brooklyn, New York was all of a sudden the #1 place for N-word because of the searches I made. It was, I made a couple searches. Some other writers in Brooklyn have probably made a couple searches, but it's swamped by the millions of searches in other part of the country by people who I think really do have racist attitudes that are making the search for that reason. So it's definitely a concern, something to keep in mind, that some people aren't making searches for curiosity, but definitely don't use that to kind of say all the data is useless, or you can't draw conclusions by where the searches are most made or when the searches are most frequently made.
Great, thank you. Nick, someone's asked a sort of Inception-style question, which is very clever, and I'm going to try and read it and do it justice. If our brain creates an illusion of coherent ideas that we call mind, isn't that the same mechanism that makes the idea of there is no mind coherent?
Yes, well, this is a clever question, yes. I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think it's not, I don't want to give the impression that, let me try and, I don't want to give the impression that the mind is, in a sense, an illusion. What is absolutely not an illusion is the conscious flow of experience. We certainly have that. And we clearly have enormous amounts of memory for past experience, which we're reusing. So our brain is incredibly complicated because it's doing this amazing metaphorical matching job of taking past experiences and repurposing past images, past words we've heard, past musical snippets we've come across, past motor actions we've engaged in, and it's repurposing those to deal with the problem of the moment. So the brain is very complicated, but the flow of conscious experience is extremely narrow. It's essentially serial. So if you're thinking to yourself, does the mind exist, or any other random verbally formulated thought, what you're aware of is that thing you're thinking of right now. I think the things that are going on underneath that are not mind-like at all. So it's not, I think the thing I want to push against is the idea that there's a kind of, the thoughts that we are consciously aware of are a tiny, like the tip of a great iceberg poking above the surface, and underneath there's lots of things very much like them. So this is the sort of, it's a standard idea of the unconscious or subconscious, is that there are thoughts I'm aware of having, but there are lots of other things which are just the same kind of thing, they're thoughts too, but they're hidden. And I think that's the illusion. And the reason that we have that illusion is that if you ask me to justify my thought, out pops an answer, or to defend myself, or to explain more, out pops more stuff. But the stuff that's hidden is nothing like the stuff that's on the surface, because the stuff that's hidden is just this vast repertoire of past experiences. The only thing that's mind-like is the thing that you're actually formulating and doing and thinking at that very moment. And the reason we know that, or I would argue the reason that we can infer that, is our fundamental incoherence. It's the Oscar Reuterswald images at the end, I think, which are decisive as a metaphor. Because if you ask people to articulate their views about just about everything, the first thing you'll discover is we're just inconsistent. You take moral issues, you take factual issues, you take mathematical issues, absolutely everything. We are simply not coherent beings. We're not coherent because we're improvising one snippet at a time.
And do you think, is this sort of hopeless? Can we get to know ourselves better? Or put a different way, should I just sack my therapist right now?
No, I think it's not hopeless at all, actually. So I mean, we should think about understanding ourselves, as I started off with, as just the same problem as understanding other people, or for that matter, understanding fictional characters. And I think fictional characters are quite a good example to think about, because in the case of fictional characters, we can have a sense, as we read a book, of getting a better understanding of the character, and we can also debate with other people, what's that character really like? What was their real motivation? But obviously there's no real answer to that, because there's nothing beyond the text on the page. There's no real mind. They don't have any thoughts that are hidden from us. And yet we still have the sense that we can engage in that process of interpretation. And I think it's just the same for ourselves and the people around us. So we can certainly engage in a perfectly valid, coherent activity, which is, why did I do that? Why did somebody else do this other thing? But we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that hidden inside them is the answer. It's just the same process of interpretation that you're engaged in when you're watching TV or reading a book.
Thank you. Seth, someone who has remained anonymous has, I'm reading panic into this, said, what about Google incognito mode? So does that stuff show up? Does it reduce the volume of searches? And once people cotton on to you and your clever games, are we all going to be hidden?
So I think, so Google Incognito, it blocks them knowing who you are, but it would still know that the search was made or where or when the search was made. And it's still a small % of searches. I think what this question captures as well, is there still is some anxiety about making searches on Google. more there is anxiety about this. So when I first started giving this talk about 6 years ago, describing my thesis that you could understand people from Google searches, that everyone's so honest on Google, there's like this guttural reaction of course, like I tell Google everything. And now I've noticed when I say it, a bunch of people are like, I don't really tell Google everything. Like, I'm a little more cautious. Like, is the government watching this? It's not quite, I think it's a little less powerful. It's a little less good at getting people don't tell Google as much as they used to. And there actually is a study on this where they looked at basically embarrassing searches related to pornography or health conditions that people might be embarrassed about or other things. And they compared the volume of these searches before and after Edward Snowden's revelation that the government was working with companies like Google to analyze data, and they found that these searches dropped about 4% after the Snowden revelation. So people do respond a little bit to concerns about privacy in choosing whether to confess their deepest secrets to Google.
I've just realised I'm controlling the big screen when I'm playing around on here. And also, I don't think many of the questions on that screen are for this session. So here's a question that a lot of people had in various different forms, the ethical trade-offs and obligations relating to this data. So should Google be flagging to people that they might have a certain disease based on what they're Googling? Should it be intervening in instances of domestic violence? Should it be kind of predicting all sorts of other things and calling the police?
Yeah, it's an open question. That's probably above my pay grade. I'm not an ethicist. There are studies that are starting to show the power of this data for those purposes. So for example, there's a remarkable study done by researchers at Microsoft where they analyzed Bing search data, where they could track the same individuals over time, which Google Trends doesn't allow you to do over a long period of time. And they looked at people who, through their searches, they could see, okay, this person just got a really bad diagnosis, pancreatic cancer. Mm-hmm. So they search something. If you get a diagnosis, you probably turn to your search engine to pancreatic cancer, now what? What do I do? Just got diagnosed. It's kind of an anxiety-provoking moment. And they were able to get this sample of a fairly large number of people because they had so many users who had just got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And then they looked at the searches they had made for symptoms in the lead up to the diagnosis. So they could basically look at, okay, what patterns of symptoms are going to... Why are people laughing about pancreatic cancer?
I think I may have accidentally changed the thing.
Okay. All right. I thought there was some joke I was missing about pancreatic.
You're like, I'll tell that one again.
Yeah. So pancreatic cancer, so they were able to find these really subtle patterns in the search data that actually some of them were unknown to doctors. For example, if you search for indigestion followed by abdominal pain, that's a serious risk factor for pancreatic cancer, whereas indigestion by itself, or abdominal pain by itself, or abdominal pain followed by indigestion is a lower risk factor. And that's really a very sophisticated way to do medicine, and more sophisticated. If you think of the way we currently measure how symptoms are going to lead to diseases, it's not as sophisticated as tracking like a really large sample over time and picking up these subtle patterns of the timing of different symptoms. And also, apologies to all the hypochondriacs in the audience, who I'm sure are going to feel indigestion and then abdominal pain this evening.
I'm a huge hypochondriac.
Yeah, I feel your indigestion followed by abdominal pain.
Nick?
Yes.
If we just make up what we want at the time of being asked, what's the point of having a democracy?
Well, I think we remember we are traditions, and those traditions are both make us somewhat stable as individuals, but also they make us stable as a society. So what you're doing when you're asking people to vote on something, for example, you are asking them in that moment, and you're not tapping into some deep core that's always true and stable about them. And if it were, of course, the polls would be very, very stable, and they aren't. But what you are picking up is a snapshot of the kinds of concerns that animate us as a population in this particular moment, at this particular time, with these particular stimuli in the media ether. And that's not perfect, but of course it's really the only thing we have. So I don't think it undermines democracy. The other thing you might worry about in the same spirit would be, should we care about giving people what they want? Because clearly they're quite unstable. Maybe we should try and take a more paternalistic stance and tell people what they must want and give them that. And I think that's probably the wrong strategy too. I think we are inherently improvisational creatures, and I think we should respect the improvisations we do, rather than thinking, well, there must be something stable in there, and if there isn't, we ought to look for it nonetheless. I think we just have to accept that we are storytelling, creative beings, and which stories and which creations we happen to be focusing on at one moment to another moment will be somewhat unstable.
And we have one person who's arguing that our propensity for seeing faces everywhere surely gives greater weight to mental depth. In other words, it's our evolved psychology rather than being a flat mind.
Well, I would just say to that we see a lot of faces. I mean, a large amount of our waking time is spent processing faces. So it certainly makes sense that when we see non-faces, we tend to see them in terms of faces rather than the other way around. But it does work in any direction. And indeed, we can see people who look like various types of animal or objects or all sorts of things. I mean, the metaphorical nature of the brain is just unbelievably sophisticated. And I think one of the things it argues against is the idea that we have sort of well-defined models of the world. So the idea that we have a well-defined model of what a face should look like, or what a body should look like, or what a room should look like, these things are very difficult to square with the fact that when you give people very distorted, very strained, very unexpected, for example, faces, as we saw just now, the brain just launches into action and can deal with them perfectly well. So I think it's absolutely true. The brain cares a lot about faces. It sees a lot of them. Maybe we're even predisposed innately to focus on faces, although I think that's to a fairly small degree if it's true. But the thing that really matters is the vast experience we have. The reason we're good at doing things now is we've done them a lot of times before, and we have a very clever metaphorical brain to take that past experience and transfer it to the new situation.
What do you think, Nick, of mindfulness meditation, which expressly uses physical cues to determine your own emotional states without identifying with them? So, sorry,
yeah.
Shall I reread the question, or is it clear?
No, well, I'll go with it. So I think that is very interesting. So on the one hand, I think one thing that's very interesting about the whole mindfulness perspective is that it allows you to step outside of the things that are going through your mind and think of them as just sort of passing, fleeting visitors. And thinking of them as something that you've conjured up in the moment is actually very valuable. Because if you don't think that, you can think, my God, that's what's really in there. You know, I'm having these terrible visions or a scary dream. That's what my mind consists of. My goodness, there's this vast, dark world inside me. But as soon as you realize, oh no, actually, I made that up just a moment ago, and I can make other stuff up. Oh look, I made something more positive. I can make anything up. Once you realize these are fleeting visitors of your own creation, I think it makes them much easier to handle. But I think another thing that's very interesting about that perspective is the focus on the body. So I think realizing that actually to make yourself feel differently subjectively, focusing more concretely on the physical cues that are associated with different emotions is a really good thing to do, because you can trick your body by breathing more slowly and relaxing your body, and then you start to think, oh, I'm feeling quite calm. I'm not as worried as I was just a moment ago, because look how calm I am. Now, the reason you're calm is rather like it's sort of the opposite of going over the high bridge. The reason you're calm is that you've made some deliberate efforts to calm yourself down physically, but that will actually have the desired effect on your mental state as well. So I think that we're actually remarkably unconcerned in a way that I think is strange about helpfully controlling our bodily state in ways that are good for us. And I think the whole mindfulness idea is actually a rather helpful counterweight to that.
So Seth, if Google tells us what people are really thinking, what does social media tell us?
They're very, very different sources of data, Google and social media. I think practitioners tend to group them together too much. The next question just says, Elsbeth, you're hilarious.
Thank you so much. Anonymous.
So they're very different sources of data, Google and social media, even though they are considered big data, because they give people different incentives. So if you think of Google, when you make a Google search or a Bing search or any search, you're by yourself and that data is not being shown to anybody else. You're just trying to get information kind of to answer your questions. Whereas if you're on social media, you're posting for all your friends to see and basically trying to give a cultivated image of who your life is. And it's actually I've done a couple studies on this. It's sometimes amusing, the comparisons between how people appear on social media versus what they're Googling. So for example, I looked at how people describe their husbands on social media and like when they're searching about their husbands. And on social media, if you put the top way if people are making a post, my husband is, the top way people complete that. Does anyone have a guess? The top social media, the way to complete my husband is?
Amazing.
Okay. Amazing. I think that's like third. It's like the best, but it's like the best, and then number 2 is greatest, and then amazing, and my best friend, and so cute. So that's like basically what people say if all their friends are seeing what's going on in their marriage, and what happens on Google when they're by themselves, when they're searching about a husband, and it's like, my husband is a jerk, my husband is annoying, I can't stand my husband, like all these very, 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 very different, and I think I'm not saying from that one source is correct and one source is incorrect. I'm not saying that that everybody always thinks about their husband, he's a jerk, he's annoying, and is always and never thinks that he's amazing and so cute and my best friend. You do think that? I
mean, I don't have a husband, but I probably would.
Okay. But yeah, I would agree that probably Google's maybe closer to accurate than social media. But I think it just does show that they're very different and they're getting a different view of people. And kind of depending on the incentives, you're going to get very different data. And it'd be interesting in further research, kind of what predicts behavior more, like what predicts divorce more if you make a social media. I always thought that you could predict divorce the more positive posts they have about their relationship. From my experience, the more likely a divorce is coming up, like right away. But nobody's ever done a study of that. But that's just like my.
There is that thing that goes around that's like a good relationship is one that's not on social media.
Yeah,
it's always shared by someone passive-aggressively on social media.
There definitely does seem to be something to that.
Thank you so much. So Nick, I think last question potentially is to you. So can you talk a little bit about if the mind is flat, what are the implications for things like profiling tools that segment people based on various characteristics?
Yes, I think there's a very good and quick answer to that, which actually connects very much with the kind of thing that Seth has been talking about, which is I think the thing you want to do if you want to profile people is to look at what they do. There's no real point just looking at what they say because they'll make that up on a different way, on a different occasion. And that's especially true for things in, say, the financial sector, because these are areas where we have very little understanding. So, I don't have a deep model. I mean, I don't have a deep model of anything, really, according to me, but I really, really don't have a deep model of my understanding of my finances or the world of financial products or risks. So if you ask me, I'll give you all kinds of junk, depending on how you ask me the question. But if you look at what I do, that will be a very useful clue about what I'm going to do tomorrow. This goes back to the mind as tradition point. What really matters about us is that each new thought and each new behavior is somewhat shaped by the previous one. So if you care about what someone's going to do next in terms of financial risk, look at what they did before.
So there's actually a fascinating study, also not mine, using kind of big data tools exactly on this point to try to predict financial risk. And they collaborate with a company, I think it's called Prosper, that it's a peer-to-peer lending group, and they got data on basically everybody's application for lending, so exactly what they said in the application, and then whether they paid back the loan or they defaulted. And they found that you could predict with pretty high accuracy whether someone's going to pay back by the words that they used. And they frequently worked in the opposite direction of what people said. So if someone says, "I promise," in their loan application, that's like a major risk factor that they're not going to pay back.
Wow.
Yeah. And then there's some weird things in data, which I guess it goes a little bit to Nick's point that we don't really understand the human mind. But if you use the phrase "thank you," you're less likely to pay back.
Wow.
Which is just like weird and also kind of disturbing, because you could imagine companies like making sense of this data or just using machine learning, and someone who legitimately is going to pay back a loan just like ends their note with, "Oh, thank you," and it's like, no, you're out. You're in the that awful group of people who say thank you on their loan applications.
That is terrifying and a wonderful place to end, I think. So please join me in thanking Nick and Seth. It's been an absolute honor.